Why I have on the video, but no, may I show the video? Yeah.
No. Yes.
Now
We
you
can
are
see,
visible.
sir.
Okay.
Yes.
Very good evening to everybody.
Good evening. Good evening.
Good evening, good
We are
evening, sir.
anxiously waiting for Rajendran to join with us.
I am here.
He's very much here.
I
He
heard
has
your
been
sound.
he has been looking for you.
Yesterday they didn't. I couldn't. I had to be in the gate. I was not admitted yesterday. What to do?
You are in the waiting room.
And then I chanced upon you. Your video was there. Audio was not there.
But one thing is that if you cannot enter tomorrow all the sessions, if any problem is there, you can open the YouTube.
Okay.
It is live telecast is there in YouTube.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Simply you have to put the Kunjuni Raja Academy of Indological Research.
Okay. Fine.
Then it will come.
Thank you. Okay.
Thank you. Sarita,
Anyway,
we can start now.
Okay, sir. I'm ready.
Yeah.
Thank
Very
you,
good.
sir. Sarvebhyo mama namaskaraha. Good evening, everybody. Our session starts now. I welcome you all to this fourth session of international webinar on highways and byways of Indological research, with special reference to the contributions of K. Kunjuni Raja. It is quite fortunate to conduct a webinar on linguistics on the centenary birth year of Professor K. Kunjuni Raja. A linguistic webinar is the most proper way to pay respects to such a scholar who dedicated his entire life for the promotion of Sanskrit as well as Indological studies. There is a small change in the fourth session of the program. Professor Saroja Bhate is not participating in the webinar due to some ailments. The 5 scholars who are to present their papers are Shri Professor Peter Scarf, Professor C. Rajendran, Professor T.B. Venugopala Panikar, Professor V.R. Muralidharan, and Dr. Adira Jathavedan. In the absence of Professor Saroja Bhate, Professor Peter Scarf is to chair the session and offer keynote address. Peter Scarf is a beloved student of great grammarian Professor George Cardona. He catalogued and digitized Sanskrit manuscripts at Brown University and Harvard University. He is now developing a computational implementation of Paninian grammar based on XML formalization of the entire Ashtadhyayi. He is visiting faculty of Hyderabad and Bombay universities. He is a good scholar in Sanskrit grammar and in Indo-European languages. He is also a teacher in Brown University, USA, and at present, he is doing his higher studies and research at Shimla Institute. Sir, I render my hearty welcome to the webinar on behalf of all the participants. Professor C. Rajendran, a scholar of international repute, was the HOD of Sanskrit in Calicut University. He is the author of more than a dozen books and research articles and a visiting faculty in universities abroad. Sir, I wholeheartedly welcome you on behalf of all participants to this webinar. Professor T.B. Venugopala Panikar is a linguistic scholar and was professor in Calicut University for a long time. He has authored many articles on linguistic studies in various journals and published books named Studies on Malayalam Language, Swanamandalam, and many such. Sir, I wholeheartedly welcome you to this session of linguistic webinar. Dr. V.R. Muralidharan, Dean of Sri Shankaracharya University of Sanskrit, Kaladi, was former HOD of the Department of Sahitya. He has done major studies on Purvamimamsa. Sir, I wholeheartedly invite you to this session of the webinar. Dr. Adira Jathavedan is working as a lecturer at Koilandi Center of Sri Shankaracharya University of Sanskrit. He has done her research in linguistic aspects on Indian theories of meaning. She is the niece of Professor K. Kunjuniraja. I welcome Dr. Adira to this session. I also welcome Professor P.C. Murali Madhavan, Chairman of KAIR Academy, Girish Paliyat, Secretary, Professor P.V. Ramangutti, Deepthi Tripathi, Dr. K.A. Ravindran, who have been the motivators and promoters of these webinar sessions. I also welcome all the learned scholars and delegates all over to attend this program. The fourth session now commences with the presentation of Professor Peter Scarf. His paper is based on insights from Paninian grammar and theory of verbal cognition for representing non-linear syntax. I cordially invite Professor Scarf to present his paper and chair this session. Sir, please.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction and the invitation to chair the session. I'm a little bit surprised, and I'm sorry that Madam Saroja Bhate is not in good health. I haven't looked at the abstracts or papers of the other presenters, so I'm not too familiar with their subjects, but I'd be glad to manage this session with your help. So, but let me begin by then presenting my paper, and then we'll proceed from there. So first I'll share my screen. And since I'm in Shimla, where the internet connection is not robust, I'll stop my video while I'm sharing the screen. Can everyone see my slides?
Yeah, surely. We are seeing.
Okay, good. Good. So we're talking about nonlinear syntax, insight from Indian traditions for developing language neutral syntactic representation. And by the way, I stopped my video just in time because the electricity just went out here and I'm sitting in the dark. Okay, so here it's an overview of my presentation. First, we'll talk briefly about the history of modern linguistics and their use of phrase structure and dependency trees. Then we'll talk about conceptual versus phonetic syntactic representation and turn to looking at how the Indian tradition of linguistics, particularly the Paninian tradition, has used this model in its presentation of grammatical knowledge. And then we'll distinguish some uses, claimed uses of Paninian syntax, which are not really Paninian at all because they're based on the phonetics rather than on the conceptual structure. And finally, I'll end with a description of the difference between linear versus multidimensional syntactic representation. So in the 20th century, linguistics was influenced by the need to prove linguistics as a science. And under the pressure of empiricism, they focused on that information that was available to the senses. In other words, the information available to the 5 senses for speech means the written word and the heard word. And meaning was given secondary status, and in fact, removed entirely from the picture. In positivist materialist empiricism, meaning is considered to be inherently subjective, directly unobservable, and thus beyond the scope of scientific investigation. Behaviorism studied human behavior, including language, in terms of habits, stimuli and responses, and neglected meaning almost entirely. Chomsky reacted against this positivism and behaviorism, intending to bring mind back into the scope of investigation. Chomsky has a very famous review of the behaviorist linguistics work that that became very popular, where he dumps the whole project of behaviorist linguistics. But unfortunately, Chomsky's program turned out to be sort of a formal systems approach, which separated rules of syntax from other elements of semantics, particularly the lexicon, and that ended up separating the formal project of the structure of linguistics from cultural information, and meant that linguists became more and more separated from those people who were deeply familiar with the culture and the language that was being represented. And this situation remains today, where still humanists who are deeply familiar with the culture of an area and its language are not the linguists, and the linguists are not familiar with that culture. Now let's look at the modern linguistics use of phrase structure and dependency trees. Here's a simple binary phrase structure tree of a simple sentence: Theodore sits in the garden. Now, in this phrase structure tree, we have the sentence node at the top marked by an S, and then it's split in binary branches into a noun phrase and a verb phrase. And the noun phrase has the subject, and the verb phrase has the rest of the sentence. And that verb phrase is then split into binary tree, where we've got the verb and then a prepositional phrase in the garden. And that prepositional phrase is split into binary branches, with a noun phrase split into a determiner and a noun. So the binary phrase structure tree analyzes clause into subject and predicate as initial immediate constituents. It analyzes these constituents by further binary analysis. Each phrase itself is recognized as a unitary constituent that combines with another constituent in a higher level phrase. In other words, this prepositional phrase is an entire constituent. This verb phrase is an entire constituent, which means that one can't take one element, let's say the garden, out of this phrase and put it somewhere else. It has to remain in this construct. Besides reflecting the hierarchical structure, the ordering of the branches reflects the order of words in a sentence. This structure is particularly appropriate to modern Western languages which have rigid word order. It is not appropriate for languages that have highly flexible word order. At a conference several years ago, on the International Conference on the History of the Language Sciences, a scholar presented the progress of the linguistic sciences in formalizing languages, and said we have 85% correct analysis of languages, and we're doing very well. And then a scholar got up from University of Colorado and said, Can someone's microphone is not muted. Can somebody fix that?
Okay,
A scholar
sir,
from
continue.
Colorado stood up and said, you've dealt with 17 languages and 15 of the 17 are Western European languages. And the two that are not Western European languages, namely Turkish and Arabic, you only have 60% success. And these languages have a highly inflected morphology and free word order. So in fact, the progress of linguistics is not successful in characterizing the structure of languages with freer word order. And this is particularly then true of certain ancient languages in the Indo-European family, in particular Sanskrit. So here's a different structure that modern linguistics uses. This was invented by Tenier about the same time that Chomsky began the project of formalizing language in these constituency trees. A dependency tree puts the verb at the top, and it has the other elements subordinate to the verb, including the subject. So it's rather than having the sentence node at the top and splitting the sentence into subject and predicate, the verb is at the top, and the subject is one of the participants in that action. It's one of the subordinate nodes of that action of the verb, and the prepositional phrase is broken up in this way with a hierarchy of the dependency. So the prepositional phrase is the head node, the garden is the next node, and the determiner is the bottom node. So in these dependency trees, sequence is not represented as opposed to the constituencies trees. The heads of the phrases are themselves the nodes. There are no nodes besides the actual words in the phrase. Each lexical item is a node. No additional notation is necessary for the head of the phrase. Subordinate elements in a phrase are nodes dependent on the head node. The verb is principal, and the agent is one of its arguments. And the position of the words is not essential in showing the structure. Here's a Sanskrit dependency tree where we have the verb as the top node and the agent and in this case, the locus, the word representing the locus as dependencies. The difference between this and the preceding sentence, of which this is the Sanskrit translation, is that a single inflected Sanskrit word, udyane, occurs instead of the English prepositional phrase in the garden. In the, here's the dependency tree with as permitted in Sanskrit. So Devadatta brings a pot with a cart from his house for Yajnadatta in the city. And so Devadatta Garhad Yajnadattaya Nagare Shakatena Kumbham Anayati. Here Anayati is the verb, it's the head node, and we have 6 participants in the action, all as equivalent subnodes. This means that we can rearrange these constituents in any order. So here's a rearrangement. If we rearrange the word order, it doesn't significantly change the diagram. As you can see here, Devadatta Garhat Yajnadattaya here, Devadatta Kungam Shakatena, etc. There's a different order, but essentially the structure is the same. If we make a phrase structure tree with 6 participants in the action, and do a binary splitting of the branches, we have an artificial proliferation of these verb phrase nodes going all the way down to anayati. And this is actually an artificial structure. All of these verb phrases are totally artificial structures because we know very well that these are equal participants in the action. They're not actually subordinate in chunks, such as Nagare Shakatena Kumbhamanayati is not necessarily a single node in any way next to Yagyadataya. Nagare is equal to Yagyadataya. Why should it be subordinated in a unit? So if we compare these binary phrase structure trees with dependency trees, binary phrase structure tree requires an artificial proliferation of verb phrase nodes, these VP labels, uniting constituents in single verb phrases where the ordering of these constituents in the reordered sentence shows that they are not essentially related to each other, but rather are equally related to the verb. The dependency tree for the Sanskrit sentence with 6 reordered participants differs from the dependency tree for the original Sanskrit sentence only in the insignificant horizontal placement of the dependent nodes. The hierarchical dependency structure is identical. Unordered hierarchical dependency structure more adequately captures the complex structure of thought expressed in speech than linear phrase structure does, particularly for these free word order languages. Now let's look at the difference between conceptual versus phonetic syntactic representation. Both the phrase structure trees and dependency trees shown and speech forms, either phrases or words, as elements in the hierarchical structure of language. However, because speech is one-dimensional, nothing in the phonetics of the speech itself directly indicates any hierarchical structure. In fact, the structure is a feature of the conception of the speakers of the language, not of the speech forms itself. The relations that hold between the constituents in that structure are relations among concepts, that is, meanings, not among the speech forms that denote them. Now, Chomsky considered generative grammar to be a system of knowledge in the mind of the speakers. Tehnier, the founder of these dependency trees, recognized that hierarchical structure precedes linear order in the speaker's consciousness. Despite the fact that these formal linguists recognize the mental nature of hierarchical linguistic structure, that fact is lost in their formalisms. The trees show relations among speech forms, not among concepts. In phrase structure trees, the sequence of speech forms is paramount. In transformational grammar, position in an underlying sequence was taken to be significant. So in transformational grammar, you'd start with a base sentence. For example, David Dutta cooks rice. And you would consider rice is cooked by David Dutta as a transformation of that sentence. And it was derived by moving constituents from their underlying position, and that underlying position was taken to be significant. Investigators typically referred to a subject position, object position, etc., and they even categorize languages in terms of whether they're SOV, subject, object, verb languages, or subject, verb, object languages, or verb, subject, object languages, and so on. The motivation of linguists to focus on speech was solely due to naive materialism. The description of syntactic roles as associated with place and movement, and the representation of syntax in trees is entirely motivated by naive materialism and the pressure on scholars to make their science of linguistics conform to an empirical model in which the only evidence available is delivered through the senses. Now let's look at multidimensional structure. And I term this consciousness-based linguistics. Thought is more complex than speech. As I said, speech is one-dimensional. Thought is multi-dimensional. Mathematicians think in terms of n dimensions. And physicists these days think in terms of the structure of the universe in terms of 11 or 12 dimensions rolled up into the 4 that we actually experience. Thought is more complex than speech. It can accommodate multidimensional structures. So the ideal consciousness-based linguistics should examine the cognitive structures and base the syntactic relations on the cognitive structure rather than on focusing on the word order of the speech forms in a sentence. This kind of cognitive structure, a complex cognitive structure, can then be projected onto a two-dimensional structure or a single line of speech. And this is typical of the way that that the complex sciences, the exact sciences, physics, for example, thinks about the structure of the universe. Multidimensional, 11-dimensional structure is projected onto fewer dimensions in what is called, for example, projective geometry. In this way, we would explain speech in terms of thought rather than explaining thought in terms of speech. In other words, the primary element in linguistics should be the thought, not the speech. Paninian linguistics does exactly this. Paninian linguistics begins with semantics, categorizes semantics based on certain semantic and co-occurrence conditions, for example, karakas, introduces abstract speech forms that represent those categories. In other words, vibhaktis, L affixes, and then modifies those abstract morphemes, and finally introduces phonetic changes. The entire project begins with semantics. It assumes that the structure, the cognitive structure, belongs to the meanings, and all of the speech forms are hung on to that cognitive structure. Here we have a typical example of the application of dependency tree analysis to Sanskrit, where the speech forms are considered primary. We have a simple sentence, Devadatta cooks rice. Pachati is considered to be the principal element, and Devadatta and Odana are participants in it with the branches labeled Kartar and Karman. Actually, the word Devadatta is not the Kartar, and Odana, the word Odanam, is not the Karman. The Kartar is Devadatta, and the Karman is the rice. It is not the speech form, nor are they subordinate to the word Pachati. They are subordinate to the action. The proper dependency tree in Paninian grammar is this, where I show the meanings in square boxes rather than in ovals. The cognition as represented here is the way that Kaundabhatta would formulate it. Kaundabhatta, 17th century cognitive scientist, I would call him, or cognitive linguist. So he would give the cognition that arises from the sentence Devadatta cooks rice as follows: Devadatta kartaka odana karmaka pak anukula vyaparaha. So the activity favorable to cooking, that's represented here, the paka, that has Devadatta as its agent and rice as its object. And the passive sentence would have the same structure. Devadattena odanaha pachite would have exactly the same structure according to Kaundapatta. Now, the deficiency in this word unit dependency tree is that word unit trees do not distinguish the activity of the agent from the result that takes place in the object. In other words, Kaundapatta properly distinguished vyapara from the phala. Second, it takes the nominative rather than the verbal termination to represent the agent. Okay, the nominative Devadatta here is taken to represent the agent. Actually, the dip, the ting suffix, is what represents the agent in the Paninian analysis. The word unit tree does not describe the sense of the verbal stem forming this shup and yuck in the passive. So it just leaves them out, right? The morphemes aren't shown at all, the whole word units are shown. The word unit paraphrase does not mention the particular character of the result of cooking, the vikliti of the rice. The particular relation the agent has with the activity and the object has with the result. It doesn't mention that they're the substrates of the activity and the substrate of the phala. Nor does it mention the number or gender of the agent or object, nor does it mention the generic property of the object and other properties of the object. A proper cognitive dependency tree should mention these things. As a representation of the structure of cognition, dependency trees should include meanings as nodes rather than words. And because Indian linguists introduce morphemes under specific conditions, information is available to show how these morphemes denote the cognitive concepts. The mapping of these morphemes, however, is not trivial. Here's a detailed cognitive paraphrase, according to Kaundapatta, of Devadatta Odanam Pachati. Odana tvat jati punlinga ekatva sankhya vishishta odana abhina karma ashrita vikliti anukulaha punlinga ekatva sankhya vishishta Devadatta abhina kartar ashritaha vartamana kalakaha vyaparaha. You can see my English translation here. The activity of cooking in present time that resides in the agent, which is no different from Devadatta, who is qualified by masculine gender and singular number. Which activity is favorable to softening that resides in the direct object, which is no different from rice, which is qualified by the generic property riceness, masculine gender, and singular number. Here's a dependency tree of all of that information. This dependency tree has activity, vyapara, as principle. The result is subordinate to the activity by the relation of being its result. So here we have vyapara, here's the phala, and it's subordinate to this vyapara by the relation of janyata adharata. The occurrence of the activity in present time, vartamana kala, is subordinate to the activity by the relation of being the temporal substrate of that activity. Here we have vartamana kala. I'm sorry, I read that wrong. The vikliti, the phala, is in the subordinate relation by janyata, the relation of janyata, and the kala by the relation of adharata. And the agent is subordinate to the vyapara by the relation of ashrayata, that is, of being the substrate of that activity. And the relation, the karman is shown here, subordinate to the vikliti or the phala by being its substrate by the relation of ashrayata. And this karman is no different from the odana. The kartar is no different from devadatta. And in the odana, we have the odana tvajati, punlinga, and ekatva sankhya by the relation of samavaya. And in devadatta, we have punlinga and ekatva sankhya, also by the relation of samavaya. So this is a complete representation of the cognition of that sentence as understood by the 17th century cognitive scientist Kaundabhatta. So I think I've gone over now all this information here. So there's one difference from the way would represent it that I've included here, and that is the grammarians give a non-directional description of the relation between the activity of the agent and the result. For example, jana-janaka sambandha. This doesn't show the direction of the relationship. The logicians, the Nyayikas, show relations in a directional way by having the relation be located in one element and be described with respect to another element. I take the arrow to point from the relation in which it is located, from the substrate in which that relation is located, and point in the direction of the object with respect to which it is described. So this description is nirupita, and the being located is this nishta. So the vikliti nishta janyata, the property of being generated, which is located in the softening, is described with respect to, is nirupita, with respect to the vyapara, which is located, I'm sorry, it's described with respect to the janakata, the property of being a generator, which is located in the activity. So the logician's directional description of the relation of the result towards the activity can also be represented in this way as vyapara nishta janakata, nirupita, vikliti nishta janyata. So here we have the janyata as the relation. And I've chosen to do this in the logician's way, and to use and to have the arrows point from the subordinate to the head node by using this relation here at the bottom, rather than this relation. Now, here what I show is how the morphemes of Devadatta Odanam Pachti map onto that tree shown in the previous diagram. So the morphemes are shown in the ovals, and the same structure shown in that other diagram is represented here in the square boxes. So the root denotes, according to Kaundabhatta, both the vyapara and the phala. So we have the arrows pointing from Pach to both of these elements. And the suffix T denotes time, as well as denoting the agent and singular number. The nominal, the shup, the stem forming affix in the active voice, I have here in gray because it co-signifies the agent rather than denotes it. And here Devadatta denotes the person of Devadatta, and also denotes Punlinga. This is the Pratipadika here, Devadatta. And the nominal termination denotes that singular number over here. And similarly, we have the accusative singular termination denoting the karman, and singular number, and the nominal base denoting the gender and generic property, and the individual, the vyakti and the jati. So this is a complete mapping of morphemes onto the cognitive structure represented in the cognitive structure trees, which I see as a representation of the cognitive structure descriptions given by Kondabutta in the 17th century. In these cognitive dependency trees, the cognitive concepts are shown in boxes, the morphemes in ovals. The signification of concepts by speech forms is shown by dotted arrows. Denotation is shown by a black dotted arrow, the co-signification by gray dotted arrows, and the principal element in the cognition is shown at the top. And in the active construction, well, I went over everything already here. And this is a map now of the passive construction, which has exactly the same tree structure with the square boxes, but there are some differences about the denotation. Pachyate, the passive suffix here, is denoting the present time and the singular number, and the ya suffix of yak, the passive stem forming suffix, is co-signifying the pala. And what else is significant to show here? Well, I think you get the picture. So let's conclude. Asia has a few differences. According to Kondabutta, the cognition from a passive sentence is the same as the active sentence, whereas Nagesha has some differences. He considers that the cognition in the cognition of the passive, the result, pala, is the principal element, and the activity, vyapara, is subordinate to it, rather than the pala being dependent on the vyapara. Nagesha also considers time to be an essential feature of the principal activity, denoted by the root rather than by the verbal termination. The verbal termination is just a dyotaka co-signifier. Now, let's summarize. Language permits the expression of complex multidimensional cognitive structures in the single dimension of auditory speech. The effort to establish linguistics as an empirical science led linguists to restrict attention to the aspects of language immediately perceptible by the five senses. Phrase structure analysis and transformational grammar in particular imbues the linear sequence inherent in expressed speech with structural significance, which it doesn't really have. Regarding Indian cognitive linguistics, Indian cognitive linguists offer detailed analyses of cognitive structures. Paninian grammar accounts for Sanskrit usage in a generative grammar that begins with concepts in the consciousness of the speaker, organizes those concepts in cognitive structures, maps speech forms onto elements in those cognitive structures, applies morphophonemic and phonetic operations to produce linguistically valid expressions in linear speech. Paninian cognitive linguistic analysis restores the realm of consciousness to a position of priority in linguistic analysis. Now, let me speak a minute about the computational application I foresee in implementing a science of linguistics on a consciousness-based science of linguistics. The conclusions of the grammarians regarding cognitive linguistic structures and the mapping of speech forms onto cognitive structures by Paninian generative grammar offers precise apparatus to represent the cognitive linguistic structures expressed in Sanskrit. Over the past few years, I produced a formalization of Panini's grammar in XML, which I call Paitambari. My teacher in Benares nicknamed me Pitambara, and as a production of mine, with the help of my two assistants, Tanuja Ajotikar and Anuja Ajotikar, we created this formalization, completing it in 2018. And now I'm currently producing a computational implementation of it. A full computational implementation will produce a comprehensive Paninian lexicon enriched with the representation of internal dependency relations and with external dependency relations in the form of expectancies. In other words, it's not possible for us to start in the true Paninian sense with whole utterances. We'll only be able to create individual word forms, and those relations of objects which depart from being included within single word forms will be the external dependencies of these word form products. And that will allow us to assemble them in higher structures. The result will facilitate the precise dependency analysis of Sanskrit sentences and the development of a Sanskrit parser that constructs cognitive dependency trees. I show here a reference to my article in 2016, an XML formalization of the Ashtadhyayi, which describes the formalization, and which I presented at the World Sanskrit Conference in Bangkok in 2015. And this Insights from Paninian Grammar and Theory of Verbal Cognition will be published here at the Advanced Indian Institute of Advanced Study in Shimla in its studies in humanities and social sciences. At sanskritlibrary.org, I have some examples of the derivations on this basis, which are available for anyone to look at. And I, of course, appreciate the comments of competent Vyakaranas on these. I'm going to show it on my local machine, just so that it'll be more efficient to bring it up here. These are the derivation here. So for example, the derivation of, well, let's take for example, derivation of bhavati. I did it in two different ways, and I show it here step by step what happens in the initial semantic conditions and the rules one by one that introduce all the elements until we get the final speech form. So without taking any more time, let me stop sharing my screen and ask if there are any questions, or shall we proceed immediately to the next speaker and have questions at the end? What's the scheme?
Thank you, Peter Scott. Thank you, Peter.
By the way, my name is pronounced, by the way, my name is pronounced Sharp. Sharp.
Peter Sharp.
Last name is Sharp,
yeah,
yes.
Yeah. Peter Sharp.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you for your presentation. And now the time is running short. And now four more speakers are there. So I request each speaker to limit the time to 20 minutes of presentation. And now Dr. Sarita Maheshwaran, the convener of the session, may call the next speaker.
Okay, sir. Our next present paper is on Kunjuni Raja is a sociolinguist. The paper is being presented by Professor C. Rajendran. I cordially invite Professor Rajendran sir to present his paper. Please, sir. Mic mute.
Hello, hello,
Okay.
hello.
We can
Is it?
hear. We
Yeah.
can hear Rajendran.
Okay, okay. Good evening, all my friends and admirers of Professor Kunjuni Raja, who was a great Indologist and linguist. My paper is a tribute to Professor Raja, who has done substantial work in sociolinguistics. I will just read out the paper without much introductory remarks, as we are running short of time. Kunjuni Raja was an outstanding scholar of manifold research interests, including literary history, historiography, philosophy of language, and linguistics. He had a special fascination for linguistics, and with his scholarship in Sanskrit grammar and philosophical systems like Nyaya and Mimamsa, he could always bridge the gap between ancient and modern disciplines with his insightful inputs. Accordingly, he could interpret ancient Indian theories on meaning in the light of modern developments in linguistics and language philosophy with clarity. It is remarkable that being engrossed in such philosophical theorizations, Dr. Raja could also find time to analyze linguistic data against the background of society using the tools of sociolinguistics, one of the most important branches of hyphenated forms of modern linguistics. It is well known that there are only a handful of such sociolinguists in the Sanskrit research community, like Professor Madhu Deshpande. It is also remarkable that Dr. Raja penned a seminal paper titled Language of Social Hierarchy as early as in 1960, when sociolinguistics was in its infancy. In this paper, Dr. Raja states emphatically the importance of sociolinguistics and sociological approach to language study. Thus, quote, language is a social activity and belongs to an organized and relatively self-sufficient community. It has to be analyzed from a sociological background if it is to be properly understood. Just as the anthropologist studies language as a tool for understanding the cultural pattern of a society, the true linguist must make use of the cultural background of the society in order to understand its language properly. Unquote. This perception can be seen as a refreshing shift from the approach of generativists and others who tend to bracket off variables like socio-cultural factors from linguistic analysis, branding them as extra linguistic features. For die-hard structuralists and generativists, engagement with variations in usage in language would appear to be confusing and diverting uh, the linguist's attention from the wonderful abstract system that separates language from other communication systems. I'm quoting from Spolsky, Sociolinguistics, 1998. But for Dr. Raja, engagement with structural linguistics did not mean disregard for complex social realities which determine linguistic usage in specific contexts. A welcome feature of Dr. Raja's sociolinguistic explorations is that he does not confine himself to a particular language, though his focus is on Sanskrit and Malayalam. Instead, he has taken pains to survey a great number of linguistic data by extending his investigations to the speech practices of a number of languages, including English, French, Latin, Japanese, Carib, Javanese, German, Italian, Tamil, Portuguese, Spanish, Siamese, Hungarian, and Chinese. This makes his attempt sufficiently broad-based for theorization. In his engagement with sociolinguistic problems, Dr. Raja has investigated how class distinctions in society are reflected in linguistic usage. With regard to the language of social hierarchy, the chosen topic of his investigation, Raja makes only a modest claim that it is only a minor aspect of quote, intimate interconnection between linguistic behavior and social background, unquote. Though he rightly points out that it has not received adequate attention from linguists or anthropologists. He points out that the reflection of class distinctions in society in its linguistic behavior is more prominent in certain languages like Malayalam and surprisingly Japanese than in others, where there are norms only for polite speech. Raja is aware of the fact that social hierarchy is not a static phenomenon and that all the linguistic peculiarities based on it are fast disappearing everywhere in the development of democratic ideals of a classless society. He refers to the experience of Rip Van Winkle, which he had to face when he uttered innocently in the post-revolution America. Rip Van Winkle, I'm a poor, quiet man, a native of this place, and a loyal subject of the king. God bless him. You can imagine what happened. Socio-political changes could be at times momentous. In such a situation, such speech reflecting social hierarchy has assumed new guises in the form of polite speech if it has not disappeared completely. Raja implicitly recognizes the importance of documenting and theorizing such usage by scanning a wide range of data scattered in different languages. Raja identifies Bharata's Natyashastra, especially its 19th chapter, as a mine of information with regard to the dialectic variations based on rank, sex, and locality, and the different modes of address in ancient India. Other texts which he makes use of consist of Smriti texts like Manusmriti and Yajnavalkya Smriti, Vatsyayana's Kama Shastra, and literary texts like the Mahabharata, Ramayana, Abhijnana Shakuntala, Kumara Sambhava, and Uttar Ramacharita. Occasionally, Raja refers to linguistic usage attested by playwrights like William Shakespeare and George Bernard Shaw, especially Pygmalion, authored by George Bernard Shaw. Raja refers to the prescription of in the Natya Shastra as to the mode of address in relation to various characters of different socio-cultural stature. Accordingly, ascetics and teachers are to be addressed as Bhagavan, Brahmins as Arya, a respectable person as Bhava, one of equal status as Marsha or Marisha. Raja lists other forms of address found in texts like Ayushman, Bhadramukha, Aryaputra, Vatsa, Bhavati, Hanje, Bhattini, and Bhartradariye. Theoretical prescriptions are also matched by the data found in Sanskrit drama. Raja locates the bilingual nature of Sanskrit drama in the wider context of multilingualism prevalent in ancient societies like that of India. Particularly, he refers to the linguistic practice among the tribes like the Caribs. Among the Caribs, the men speak Carib, but women the Arawak language. It may be pointed out that the reason for this anomaly is the fact that Carib men used to kill Arawak men and keep their women as slaves. Raja likens this to the practice seen in Sanskrit drama, where educated Brahmins and kings and other persons of high status speak Sanskrit, while women and inferior characters speak Prakrit. Of course, no killing is involved here. Raja refers to have grasped the complexity of linguistic scenario in Sanskrit plays, as high caste itself is no guarantee for entitlement to Sanskrit. The uneducated Brahmin Vidushaka is a Prakrit speaker here. Similarly, gender itself does not preclude the possibility of a woman talking in Sanskrit. Those educated women ascetics like Pandita Kaushiki speak Sanskrit. The allocation of various types of Prakrit to people of different status is an interesting socio-linguistic issue, which has been omitted by Dr. Raja, but we can see discussions of this in Deshpande. Often in Sanskrit literature, we encounter linguistic issues. An interesting passage located by Raja in Ramayana is a self-reflexive statement of Hanuman as to the language which he has to use when speaking to Sita. Vajam choda harishyami manushimiva samskritam yadi vajam pradasyami dijari diriva samskritam Ravanam manyamanamam Sita bhida bhavishyati Maya Santo idum shakya na anyatheyam anindida. What Hanuman says is that if I speak chaste, pure Sanskrit, refined by Panini, Sita will think that I am Ravana in disguise, because Ravana is a very educated person and she will become afraid. So I have to console her, and so I have to use the ordinary language used by ordinary human beings. So Hanuman here decides to upon ordinary human Sanskrit rather than the Brahminical Sanskrit to speak to Sita, as otherwise it would generate suspicion in her that Ravana is talking to her in the guise of Hanuman. One interesting area of survey in Dr. Raja's paper is the socio-linguistic dimensions in the usage of personal pronouns. Raja points out that the English language started using second person plural like ye and you instead of thee and thou when French politeness was introduced to the English language in the Middle Ages. It appears that before that English was not that much polite. You since then has become universal irrespective of social position. To express respect, its genitive and a substantive have to be used, as in your excellency and your lordship. In the French language, the singular tu and plural vous for second person pose some interesting issues. Ordinarily, tu is used to address a deity at one extreme and servants as well as people of inferior rank and children and very intimate persons at the other extreme. Normally, tu is used in the place of the formal wo outside proper domestic sphere, and that is insulting. But using wo in the place of tu could also be very insulting, as in the case of intimate friends and lovers. In this regard, Raja quotes Vendris, who points out that the most violent words that anger and hate can employ admit of certain uses which have been softened and mellowed. Raja humorously concludes, the day one is allowed to address one's friend as tu instead of who will be a memorable one, especially for lovers, unquote. From Raja's study, we can see that there is some decrease in the use of second person singular everywhere, probably due to the democratization the society is undergoing. In Tamil, the singular ni is fast disappearing. In languages like German, Italian, and Hindi, the second person singular is replaced by third person plural to express respect. For example, Hindi, aap. In Malayalam, there are at least half a dozen terms to address a person, suggesting various shades of respect. The Sanskrit Atra Bhavan and Malayalam Avidunna, both indirect references, are used in lieu of Twam and Ningal to show respect. Raja further points out that in Sanskrit, the second person singular Twam is generally avoided in speech and substituted by Bhavan, Bhagavan, etc. This is something which we have forgotten, unfortunately, in conversational Sanskrit. In this connection, Raja quotes Manu and Yajnavalkya, who censure the use of Tonkara. Another interesting maxim quoted by Raja is that the proper name as well as the personal pronoun Tum are to be avoided in the case of elders. Twankaram Namatheyam cha Jeshtanam Parivarjayet. Raja cites the interesting anecdote in the Karnaparvan of Mahabharata, where Krishna advises the furious Arjuna, keen on killing Yudhishthira for the insults heaped on him, to address him instead using the second person singular Tum. Tum ityatra bhavandam Tum bruhi partha Yudhishtiram. Tum ityukto hi nihato gurur bhavati bharata. Like, according to Raja, the usage of honorific titles varies from one society to another. He mentions the fact that there are honorific titles and forms of address still meticulously used in England, like the Very Reverend, Reverend, Honorable, Right Honorable, etc. But at the same time, the usage of words like professor and doctor as honorific titles is diminishing in England, though it is continued in many parts of the world, including India. In this connection, Raja recalls the interesting experience of Aldous Huxley, who found, much to his amusement, himself being referred to as professor throughout in his stay in India. Raja records that honorific titles are losing their importance due to constant usage. He lists many honorific terms seen in ancient inscriptions and literary works of Malayalam. They include Tiruvilakku, Tiru Amrutha, Tiru Ennai, Nirattu Palli, Tiruvullam, etc. Another particular usage is the plural form of the first person for self-reference. Raja shows that the plurality of royalty, as seen in Sanskrit plays like Abhijnana Chagundala, as in expressions like Ko Vayam, Ko Parakshamanmato, Mrigashabai Sama, Ethido Janaha, is paralleled by similar practices in other languages like Latin and English. Thus, the king in Shakespeare's Macbeth states, "We will keep ourselves till supper time alone." Possibly in a jocular vein, Raja also records that another group of people who prefer to use first person plural for self-reference are the powerful modern editors and journalists who use ourselves to refer to themselves. The other side of the spectrum is forms of politeness. Raja refers to certain expressions of politeness in some languages which may sound amusing to other language users. For example, the description, your humble servant, was appropriate in English, which is still continued in Indian English in some places. And the slave says is the norm in Persian. Raja also records that both Siamese and Hungarians have slave for the first person singular. Adiyan in Malayalam and Tamil, as well as Padadasa in Sanskrit are their Indian counterparts. Raja has made extensive study of Achara Bhasha, the language of etiquette as practiced in Malayalam and Sanskrit. He rightly points out that self-denigration was an accepted norm in hierarchical societies. The Achara Bhasha was not confined to the upper class of society. It included the deity also. With a system of hypergamy and matrilinear succession prevalent in Kerala, even the wife and children of a Raja or Namburi, or often belonging to a lower strata in the social hierarchy, had to use the Achara Bhasha in their daily life. Raja points out that this. Will you please switch off, please? Hello, hello. Please mute the mic. Yeah, thank you. Even the wife and children of a Raja or Namburi, often belong to a lower strata in the social hierarchy, had to use the Achara Bhasha in their daily life. Raja points out that this elaborate language etiquette does not seem to have existed even in Japan with such strictness as it is seen in Kerala. According to Raja, in the languages used in hierarchical societies, there were two sets of terms, one used for the servant's affairs and another for those of the master. Servant and master refer only to the social position and caste to which they belong and not to their economic position. Raja also mentions the fact that the social change towards democratization are taking at rapid speed and that many of the customs are fast disappearing. However, it is also a fact that the custom is a part of history and is reflected in literary works, including those written even in the 20th century. In Achara Bhasha, as practiced in Kerala, the servant was supposed to answer with the term Eran, king, and Adiyan, servant. The former was popular in the north and the latter in the south. The term Vida Kolluga, meaning to get your permission, was used on many formal occasions. Accordingly, Adiyan Vida Kollam could mean anything like I shall say, I shall go, and I shall come. Food, dwelling place, travel, and even death were represented in two different ways in languages like Malayalam as a part of this etiquette. The house of the inferior person was always supposed to be referred to as Kuppada Kuppamadam, the hut in the gutter. And the term to be used in the case of the master's dwelling place depended on his caste, like Mana for Nambudiris and Kovilagam for princes. The servant should always refer to the master's food as Amrda or Amrdet, ambrosia, to his own as Karikadi, dirty rice water. The paddy used by the person of inferior stature was Nelpadir, chaff, rice as Kalleri, rice full of stones, and salt as Manal Aharam, sand food. Terms like Kapi Amrdat came to be used to account for new items like coffee. Raja demonstrates how this method of denigrating oneself and one's own possession and venerating the addressed person in his possession is also seen in Japanese language and the Chinese language. Achara Bhasha is also used in religious texts like those of the Vaishnavites, wherein the deity and the devotee have a master-slave relationship. Everything related to the deity is referred to with the honorific prefix Tiru. The food of the deity is Amuthu, ambrosia. The temple is Tirukovil and festival Tiruvilayadan. The Lord's sleeping room is Tirupalliyarai and his taking food is Amuthu Saidal. This tradition is extended by them even to the sphere of daily life. Let me conclude with a passing reference to another aspect of Dr. Raja's contribution to our understanding of the usage of Sanskrit. That in different parts of the vast subcontinent, that is India, which is always neglected. Each and every part of the country has its own tradition of pronunciation, and each province boasts of the purity of its own. Raja explores the myth of the pristine purity of local pronunciation. He singles out Kerala pronunciation and shows that Kerala has developed its own regional peculiarities, as in the pronunciation of A as A, Jaya will be pronounced as Jaya, and nasal conjunctions like Nd and J as N and Nya respectively. Like Chandanam is pronounced as Chandanam and Anjana is pronounced as Anjana in Kerala traditional manner. Many such features may be actually mother tongue pull, such as we experience in regional pronunciation of English in India. And this will happen even in the case of the Vedic language, because even there we find a lot of regional variations. What is more important is the readiness on the part of the linguist not to succumb to regional chauvinism and to analyze data with a scientific spirit. Kunjuni Raja has amply demonstrated that he has this quality in adequate measure as a sociolinguist, and one hopes that this will be emulated by language scholars all over India. Thank you very much for the patient listening.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much for delivering such a thought-provoking lecture, sir.
Thank you.
Then our next paper is to be presented by Professor T.B. Venugopala, and the paper is based on the subject Kunjuni Raja's papers on Malayalam linguistics. Sir, I cordially invite you to present the paper. Sir, please unmute your mic and start the session.
Professor Mpanikar, please unmute your microphone. We can't hear you.
Sir, Venugopalan sir, Panikar sir, we can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yes,
Can
please,
hear.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. My paper is not on Malayalam linguistics, but Kunjaniraja's papers on linguistics in Malayalam. I concentrate mainly on Kunjaniraja's book Bhasha Gaveshanam, which appeared in 1962. I have written down about 20 pages, and it will be atrocious if I read through it through and through. So I will skip certain pages. It's useful even to read the introductory remarks by Professor, late N.V. Krishnavayar to this book, but I don't go into that details. Warrior introduces Kunjuniraja as one of who has always tries to update his knowledge in various fields of knowledge, including linguistics, and who strives for creating interest in linguistics among the reading public in Malayalam. And the opening paper is on Bhasha, language, and he depends mostly on a course in modern linguistics, which appeared in 1958. It was still quite new to us Malayalam readers in 1962. And the concepts are clearly explained. And it's to be borne in mind that he presents Hackett and he shows a kind of mentalistic leanings and a behavioristic approach rather than Chomsky, awareness of Chomskyan revolution. One may also note that while explaining the nature of phaetic communion, Raja steps into the realm of sociolinguistics. Sociolinguistics was not yet a new subject, even a new subject during those times. We may also remember that it was he who authored one of the pioneering papers on social stratification of language as early as 1963. A revised version of it appeared in 1985. I'm not going into that details. Rajendran has already talked about his contribution to sociolinguistics. So I skip those papers. And he also talks about the total effect in literature and what is the contribution of rhyming, alliteration, etc. for our literary appreciation. And he talks also about the history of Manipravalam as a passing reference. He never makes a reference to Vedachodiam, the 11th century grammar, where Manipravalam was defined, etc. So he has certain gaps in his knowledge, unfortunately. The fifth paper is about the conflicting views of scholars regarding the origin of Malayalam language and its relation with Tamil. Raja favors the view that Malayalam developed its distinctiveness in 9th century CE. While explaining this, he successfully points out unjustifiable claims of some of the authors of Malayalam and hasty generalization that some make, and suppression of certain facts and favoring of certain facts by certain scholars. He talks about quotation from Kumarila Bhatta's 8th century CE, which appears in Caldwell's comparative grammar. Caldwell tells that Kumarila Bhatta talks about Andhra Dravida Bhasha, and Raja tells us the correct reading is Adha Dravida Bhashayam rather than Andhra Dravida Bhasha. Raja tells us that the whole of Kumarila Bhatta's Tandravartikam, Andhra Bhasha is never mentioned, nor any linguistic item quoted from Telugu. It contains only a few quotations from Tamil, and the phrase is Adha Dravida Bhashayam, meaning see below the words from Tamil. Raja means that Andhra Dravida Bhasha is a misquotation and tells us that this misquotation first appeared in Burnell's paper, which appeared in the volume 1 of Indian Antiquary in 1872. We see that It's being copied by Western as well as Indian scholars. Later volumes of the journal, says Raja, contains paper correcting this misreading. Anyway, here it is difficult to accept Raja's argument because now we know that the phrase Andhra Dravida Bhasha is known to Indo-Aryan speakers and scholars. Buddha Ghosha, for example, lived 3 centuries before Kumarila Bhatta, used the term Andhra Dravida Bhasha to refer to the language of South India. Footnote given by Shangunni Nair in his paper, in his book, 1995, page 16. The sixth paper in this book talks about the relation between Malayalam and Sanskrit. The well-known fact that these languages belong to 2 different families is stressed here. The importance of this paper is that it deals with the problem of language convergence also, a point not noticed by many scholars during those times. All through the history of Indo-Aryan languages, he admits, there has always been influences from other languages in India and predominantly Dravidian languages and Ostic languages. The origin of retroflex consonants, for example, the frequent use of participial nouns as predicates, etc., are fine examples. For lexical loans in Sanskrit from Dravidian and Ostic, he quotes profusely from various papers dealing with the subject. One cannot ascertain whether a word is a borrowal into Sanskrit merely on the basis that the sound similarity. Some can even be accidental. Some can be through the result of onomatopoeia. We have to follow some well-defined principles and determine whether the word is a loan word or not. He gives us 3 principles, and on the basis of those 3 principles, he determines whether it's a loan word or not. This is a development of Camino's paper on the subject. Based on these principles set forth by Dravidiologists, he examines certain claims of some Dravidiologists and raises serious doubt regarding some of the suggested Dravidian etymology of certain Sanskritic words. Raja points out that some of the Dravidian loans are through Prakrit and some Indo-Aryan loans are directly from Dravidian languages and some through Prakrit, and these need be distinguished and made clear. At one time, there was a tendency to Sanskritize even proper names, either by replacing a native brain by an apparent Sanskrit equivalent, similar in phonology. As a passing reference, Raja says that many old Vedic words do not have reflexes in later languages. For example, the Vedic Ashwa, instead of that, we have in modern Indo-Aryan languages, Ghoda, horse, which appears first in Avastambha Shravada Sutra, which came from southern part of India. And this statement is, however, due to the ignoring Sinhala language. Sinhala has only the reflex of Ashwa, not at all. And the Minikoi language also has As for house, not Koda. Many Tatsala loans from Sanskrit used frequently in Malayalam have undergone seventh paper deals with semantic shift. Artham Arya. The 8th paper is on loan words concentrating on Malayalam language. It elaborates changes that borrowing have caused in various layers of the receiving languages, from the phonology to semantics. The 9th paper, as we have already seen, is on social stratification expressed in language like Malayalam. The next is on the acquisition of language by children, a favorite topic of psycholinguistics, which was a very new subject during those days. Then the next is on F.W. Ellis paper written as early as 1816, which appeared in 1878. Kunjani Raja gives a kind of critical translation with some commentary notes of this paper. It was this scholar Ellis who first showed that there is a distinct Dravidian family in India. He has also explained similarities and differences between Tamil and Malayalam, stressing on the characteristic changes in Malayalam. Without being aware of Professor Raja's paper on Ellis, some later scholars have attempted an annotated translation of Ellis' paper in Malayalam. This is true with regards to the next paper on an agreement between Samarin of Calicut and Dutch East India Company made in 1691. He makes an elaborate description of this paper, and very few Malayalam scholars have understood that he has already done this. Ullur in his History of Keralite's literature talks about certain work by the name Pakanar Tollayiram, 900 verses by Pakanar, a book claimed to have been authored by the famous outcast philosopher of Kerala. We find it only in a book written in Portuguese by some missionary who lived in Cochin between 1585 and 1633. Ullur is of the opinion that it was not really a legendary Pakanar who wrote this book, but some person might have done it during the time of that missionary and gave it to him by saying that this is by Pakanar. This is a thorough criticism of Hinduism as practiced then. This fact, however, does not reduce its importance. In the Portuguese work mentioned, Malayalam poem is written in a kind of Portuguese spelling and is not easy to retranscribe into Malayalam. Professor Raja have ventured into that task with considerable success. It appears that nobody has so far tried to improve this reading. The 14th paper of Raja's book is a scanty quotation from some language of the west coast of India, included in a farce written in Greek, found in Oxyrhynchus Papyra in Egypt. Scholars have differently read this Indian language items, but there is a feeling that it is Old Kannada. Raja has tried to give a kind of reading and which fits in to a kind of Kannada. This last and 15th paper is on Dravidian comparative linguistics. Part 1 of it is on earliest available records and the references to the non-Dravidian sources. Part 2 is a detailed annotated bibliography on Dravidian languages or about Dravidian languages. It stresses the importance of the language convergence in South Asia. It points out the importance of the non-literary languages in Dravidian family, which was not even heeded by many scholars during those days. The book contains an index of technical terms in English used in the text, followed by a detailed word index in Malayalam of Malayalam terms. Professor Kunjani Raja is one of the earliest Keralites who have gained strict formal training in linguistics. He makes use of this knowledge when he writes about theories about Dravidian language in general and in Malayalam language in particular. He makes use of the insights of authors like Hackett immediately after their works have appeared in print. Raja seems to have been unaware of Chomskyan revolution and has preferences for behaviorism as opposed to mentalism. It is appreciable to see that In every step, he compares and contrasts every new concept with corresponding Indian concept. For example, he says that every root, any kind of suffix, both inflectional and derivational, stem formative suffixes, preposition prefixes, particles, etc., are morphemes. He tells us that an allomorph is a rule-based formal variant, an adesha. Allomorph is just adesha. This is quite clear. Making use of libraries and archives, he gives us a reader on access to information and the history of Dravidian languages, especially Malayalam. He never makes use of the term linguistic area, but is clear about the problem of linguistic convergence in South Asia and Southeast Asia. So he goes into the concept of linguistic area, though he never uses the term. Much before the formal launching of sociolinguistics, Raja tells us with ample examples from Malayalam and Sanskrit also, how social hierarchy determines language use. A modern reader may find that very few of his assertions require some kind of corrections, as he has not taken Pali as well as Sinhalese sources seriously. Still, we may say that we will be benefited by reading this even after so many years. Even after 6 decades of its publication. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for your scholarly presentation.
I was audible, was I? You could hear me, no?
Is the paper
Yes,
printed,
yes,
sir?
you were audible. You were
Sir, Panikar
audible.
sir?
Thank you very much.
Is the paper is over?
Yeah, paper is over. Yeah,
Is the paper over?
Yeah,
Yes, sir. Yes. I couldn't hear.
Did
And,
I didn't take much time. I take only 25 minutes.
Okay, okay, sir. Yes. You have taken only 20 minutes.
20 minutes.
We are very much thankful to you. I rendered the name of the paper incorrectly.
No,
So
doesn't matter,
I want
doesn't
to.
matter, yeah.
Sorry, sir.
Doesn't
And
matter.
thank you, sir, for your scholarly presentation. And thank you, sir, once again. Our next paper is on the subject linguistic observation in Purva Mimamsa. The paper is being presented by Dr. V.R. Muralidharan. Sir, I cordially invite you to present the paper. Murali sir, please.
Thank you, Sarita. Respected Chairperson, Dr. Peter Sharp, my own respected teachers, Dr. C. Rajendran, Dr. T.B. Venugopalapanikar, Professor P.C. Murali Madhavan, and other distinguished scholars and dear friends. I salute with deep sense of gratitude before the memory of late Dr. K. Kunjuni Raja, whose birth centenary is being conducted in a most befitting manner as an academic webinar by the CARE. I am thankful to the authorities for inviting me to present a paper on the linguistic elements in Puramimamsa. I may read only some portions of my paper as the paper is a lengthy one. I may take only 10 to 15 minutes to read some selected paragraphs of my paper. Mimamsa was originated as a system of philosophy for the interpretation of Vedic injunctions. According to Indian tradition, the three disciplines, Vyakarana, Mimamsa, and Nyaya, were generally considered as the systems dealing with the proper discussion of Pada, Vakya, and Pramana. Pada, Vakya, Pramanatnya, one who is well versed in all these three areas of wisdom. Among these three systems, Mimamsa, being the Vakya Shastra, has provided with much information about syntactical as well as semantic realms of linguistics. Some of their observations are relevant even today, and such ideas are to be compared with the theories of modern linguistics to a great extent. Mimamsa is the systematic and thorough investigation or discussion on Vedic passages. It has discussed a number of problems of language from many levels of human psychology. According to Mimamsa, language is not a mere way of communicating ideas through articulated sounds, but it is the only powerful weapon to prompt us into different activities. Vedas, otherwise known as Shrudis, are infallible records, as there is no human touch in it, but are considered as pure Shabda or utterance only. Vedas Accordingly, Shabda or sound is the nature of Prarana Surupa or provocation. Language makes some urge in us to do as directed. There will be no communication and understanding without an intention on the part of the speaker to influence the practical behavior of the hearer. The concept of bhavana presented by Mimamsakas is really interesting in this context. Vedic passages are of two types. The term Veda is used to denote the mantras or brahmanas. Mantra brahmanayoho Veda namadheyam. Further, brahmanas are defined as the sentences which are of the nature of prompting, vidhayagam vakyam brahmanam. A Vedic passage of brahmana text like Agnihotram Juhodi, Vayavyena Yajeda Pashugamaha, etc., directly or indirectly provoke an urge in the proper reader or listener, we may say adhigarin, to act accordingly. Though sentences are not intended for individual or particular person, any individual can act according to the direction of the Brahmana passage. Thus, potentiality or vidhayaka sentences create an urge in the man, and they have some implication of providing extension of meaning, adhigartha pratipatti. According to the Prabhakara school of Mimamsa, any sentence is of the nature of potentiality, karyannita. Thus, a mere sentence like "this is a good book" may be a potential sentence, as it invokes an urge in us to read or to own that book. Similarly, all Vedic sentences create an urge to do the sacrifices and to attain the beneficiary results of it. The concept of bhavana promoted by the Mimamsakas as the root cause of creative urge may be considered as the unending extension of meanings in the imagination or bhavana later developed by the poeticians. Etymologically, the term bhavana denotes the urge or creativity to be satisfied and is generated in the doer. Bhavana nama bhavidur bhavananukulo bhavaka bhavagatva vyapara visheshaha. This is similar in the case of a poet also, whose imaginative power is the only root cause for good piece of literature. It is generally known as pratibha, shakti, or genius. A sentence can be broadly divided into two parts, uddeshamsha or the subject element, and vidheyamsha or the predicate element. Thus, a simple sentence like Rama goes informs about Rama and gives something new, like the movement is being happened. This view is in accordance with the Karyanyuta Shabda Bodha held by Prabhakara. Even a sentence like "please look," in which only the predicate is given, the subject "you" is understood. So a predicate is the essential element in any sentence. One of the major contributions of Mimamsakas to the syntactic relation of the language is the process of verbal apprehension. Prabhakaras hold the theory of Anyadabhidhana, or the expression of what are related, whereas the Bhattas advocate Abhidhanvaya, or the relation of what are expressed. This idea is summarized in Manameyodaya, a Mimamsa text written by Narayana Bhatta as follows in Sanskrit. Tenatra padavagadaha punapadartha midhonvayam yandi ityevam adi abhidanyaya siddhando darshido asmadadinam Sagalapadaantaraportau idarapadarthai samannidam swartham sarvapadani vadandi ityabhida anyudabhidanavadamatam. Mimamsakas admit the functioning vyapara as the most important factor in the meaning of a sentence. Hence, a sentence like Rama cooks the rice is interpreted as there is a process of cooking rice which is done by an agent Rama. This was very beautifully explained by Professor Peter Sharp. According to grammarians, the functioning is centralized on the agent, and to the logicians on the capability or kriti of the agent. Vayagaranaihi akhyadasya kartari shakti ruchyade kindu krudau shaktir laghavad. However, sentences like the car goes, ratho gachadi becomes meaningful only in the metaphoric level as far as the logicians are concerned. Prabhakara and his followers accept Abhidha as the lone function and the single function of language. According to them, it is the extensive one. It is an extensive power, like the functioning of an arrow. Ishoriva dirgha dirghadaro vyaparaha. Acceptance of Lakshana or Vyanjana is useless since they are generated through the reader's contemplation only, which is noted as Sandararthanishta or connected with some other meaning in the way. Poeticians like Bhamaha, Mugulabhatta, Kundaga, Dhananjaya, and Mahimabhatta also hold the same view of Prabhakara more or less in this regard. The followers of Kumarilabhatta, on the other hand, generally accept the metaphoric usage of language everywhere. According to them, literal sense is followed by the purport or talparya or vakyartha, which is different from the vachyartha. According to modern linguistics also, language is the most metaphoric in nature. There are three ways to convey ideas through the science system, of which use of language for conveying is the most complicated one. In it, there is no direct or indirect relation between sound and sense. The relation between sound and sense is merely attributed and hence metaphoric. The conditions for a metaphoric transfer of meaning are discussed mainly from a synchronic point of view in India. Bhattas accept Lakshana in two ways. The root cause of Lakshana is the inconsistency in the primary sense, Mukyartha Bhatha. According to Kumarilabhatta, as quoted in Kavi Prakash of Mamadabhatta, in his Kavi Prakasha, Lakshana and Gunavrutti are different in nature. Mamada quotes, Manandara Viruddhedu Mukyasthasya Parigrahe Abhidheyavina Bhuda Pradidir Lakshana Uchyade. Lakshyamana Gunair Vrtte Rishtadu Gaunata. Thus, in a metaphoric usage like this boy is lion, there is no direct resemblance between the boy and lion, but we have to accept some qualities which are similar in both the boy and lion. The qualities like valor, etc. are implied here. Mimamsakas argues the eternal or long-lasting relation between the sound and sense. Aulpattigastu shabdasya arthena sambandha. The term Aulpattiga is interpreted by Shabaraswamy as eternal nitya. However, the eternity advocated by the Mimamsakas is to be considered in a general sense, as they accept only Jadi as the residuum of Shakti or linguistic power. Dr. K.K. Raja interprets the term Aulpattiga as a continuous flow or pravaha nityada. Thus, Mimamsakas, rightly designated as Vakyashastra, had contributed substantially to the studies of linguistics and especially to the modern aspects of language studies. Indian linguistic studies are not thus connected with the grammatical rules alone, but it is related with philosophy, logic, and literature to a great extent. Actually, the richness of Indian linguistic Vakyapadiyam of Bhartragari and even the discussions of Abhidha, Lakshana, Vyanjana have attracted the scholars of modern linguistics in India. Thus, from the remote past, India has contributed and Mimamsa has contributed substantially to the field of linguistic studies. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for your informative presentation, Murali sir. And the next and the last one, I invite Dr. Adira Jadavedan. She is presenting the paper based on contribution of K.K. Raja to Indian knowledge systems. Please.
Sarvebhyo Namaha. Distinguished scholars, teachers, and my dear friends, we are celebrating the birth centenary of late Dr. K. Kunjuniraja by conducting this international webinar. And this is the second day, and many scholars have already discussed his contributions in various fields. My field of research during MPhil and PhD was Indian theories of meaning. In fact, I was drawn to this field by Dr. K. Kunjuniraja himself, who was my maternal uncle. Here, I'm presenting my paper on the contribution of Dr. K. Kunjuniraja to Indian knowledge systems. I would like to classify his contributions broadly into three. Two of them are the topics of his PhD works, that is, the contribution of Kerala to Sanskrit literature, Indian theories of meaning, and the third one, New Catalogus Catalogorum, to which he also was a contributor along with other scholars, including Dr. C. Kunjuniraja and Professor V. Raghavan. Till his graduation, he was a student of science and his BA degree was in mathematics. Perhaps his training in mathematics has helped him to present voluminous knowledge in nutshells. As we know, the classic works like Euclid's Geometry, which formed a basis for Western philosophy, and Paniyam for Indian philosophy, were compilation of the then existing knowledge in these fields. As pointed out by Kunjuniraja himself, writers in the West, while recognizing the importance of Panini's method, is the formal analysis of Sanskrit language and acknowledging their indebtedness to Panini in this aspect, have not yet paid enough attention to the Indian theories about semantics, which has a history of more than 2000 years. Even before Panini, the speculation on meaning in India can be traced back to the Vedic period. Niyukta is that branch of science dealing with the forms and meaning of verbs. Darshanas deal with the relationship between Shabda and Artha and whether the intention of the speaker and the meaning that reaches the listener are same or not. In his Indian theories of meaning, Raja has compiled the existing Indian theories of meaning. His own contributions in this regard is mainly confined to Spoda Siddhanta. As we mentioned earlier, Paniya has been the basis of Indian philosophy. There are as many interpretations of semantic aspects of Paninian as there are different branches of Indian philosophy. Thus, we can see Shabda Pramanas according to Sankhya, Yoga, Nyaya, Vaisheshika, Mimamsa, etc. Here, we can find the contribution of Kunjuniraja to the Spoda theory. In his preface to the second edition of Indian Theories of Meaning, he has answered to the criticism of his interpretation of Spoda theory by different scholars. Here he has pointed out how the linguistic part of Spoda can be separated from the monistic philosophy of Bhartrhari. Thus, referring to Professor K. A. Subramania Iyer criticism to Professor Raja's descriptions of the Prakrita Dhvani as the acoustic image or the abstract sound pattern, which is time sequence still attached to it, or the phonematic pattern that this seems to be something mental only, whereas the Bhartrhari, it is something actually uttered by the speaker and heard by the listener. He says that according to Bhartrhari, Prakrita-dhvani is the linguistically relevant sound pattern, revealing the sentence or the sphoda, which is the meaning bearer. Dr. M. Bayoda has objected to Professor Raja's sphoda theory as purely linguistic, free from metaphysical hypothesis, as it is inseparable from the monistic philosophy of Bhartrhari, with its mystic implications, and cannot be isolated from it. But to this, Professor Raja points out that Mandana Mishra himself, a great philosopher, has dealt with sphodasiddhi purely as a linguistic category. Same is the case with Nagesh Bhatta, who authored Manjusha and Sphodavada. Dharmakirti, Kumarila Bhatta, Shankara, Vajaspati Mishra, Shantarakshita are other earlier scholars who have treated sphoda theory as linguistic one. This separation of linguistics from the traditional philosophical branches itself was a great achievement. Our work on the semantic aspect of Natya Shastra is a humble attempt in the way shown by Dr. K. Kunjuni Raja. All art forms are media of communication. So, in that sense, they are all media of expression, of which one is language. To what extent the theories of linguistics are applicable to other means of communication is, to some extent, dealt with within Natya Shastra. This is what led us to initiate a semantic study of this classic work. This is a branch which is not discussed in Indian theories of meaning. Coming to Kunjuni Raja's contributions of Kerala to Sanskrit literature, it was his first doctoral thesis under the guidance of Professor C. Kunjuni Raja. Its significance is that works from Kerala were not known outside this region. As Raja himself points out, apart from the work of Shankaracharya, the only two other works known outside were Yudhishthira Vijaya of Vasudeva and the works of Villamangala. It is surprising that even today a great work like Narayaniyam is only sparsely known outside Kerala, since its author Melpathur was not only a poet but a great grammarian who has authored Prakriya Sarvaswa and Dhatu Kavya. As pointed out by Professor V. Raghavan, this book fulfilled the purpose of giving Sanskritists a full idea of Kerala's contribution to Sanskrit literature and has opened the way for future research. As mentioned at the outset, he has contributed to the preparation of New Catalogus Catalogora. It's a catalog of all works in Sanskrit, Prakrita, and Pali with a short description of the content. This also is a treasure of information for investigators. In addition to this, he has to his credit more than 500 publications in Sanskrit, English, and Malayalam, in addition to more than 20 books. He owes to his uncle, the great poet, late K.K. Raja, for inducting interest in literature and related objects, and to Dr. C. Kunjan Raja for opening the vistas of research in Sanskrit. It is to be mentioned that it was the studies of Sphoda by C. Kunjan Raja and Charideva Shastri that was taken forward by John Brough, who guided Kunjuni Raja in his research on Indian theories of meaning. As he pointed out about Sanskrit language and literature as Guhatrini Nihitan Engayanti Turiyam Vajo Manushya Vadanti, it is our honest duty to unravel their hidden knowledge to the world outside. Thank you.
Thank you, Adira, for your beautiful presentation. Thank you once again. Murali Madhav Maharshi, sir, what about the interactive session?
Yes. Can we think of some 10 minutes for discussion? 10 to 15 minutes. We are 9 now. We will have some 15 minutes for a discussion. Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir. We can hear.
I think I invite the participants for the papers are presented now. Now all the papers are open for discussion, and the learned participants may use this opportunity to discuss some of the salient features and salient points of the papers in the form of questioning their approaches, or adding something more from their point of view. So I invite the participants to participate in the discussion.
But do we have any questions from the listeners who were not speakers?
Please. Can I speak? Can I speak?
Yeah, why not?
Yeah.
Professor Panikkar, please.
Yeah, I'm in Peter Sharp has the is of the opinion that semantics is the basics of syntax. Okay.
Yes.
Yeah. Does he take anything from generative semantics? I am reminded of generative semantics, which had some influence years ago. They were criticizing Chomsky, were they not?
Well, what I was articulating was not so much that semantics is the basis of syntax, but that semantics is the starting point for all of the expression in linguistics. That it's the primary element. I'm not familiar with generative semantics.
Okay.
And so I can't address that point.
I
but
too am not proficient in it, but I am reminded of that. That's all.
Yeah.
What I would advocate is that these are not separate. That the semantics is the starting point for organizing the, which is then organized, and the organized semantics is the basis for the structure, the cognitive structure, and it's the speech forms which are secondary. So I'm more emphasizing not starting from a word order approach, which is what the modern tradition does.
Are you of the opinion that there is something of the nature universal semantics or something like that? Are you favoring?
So that's a difficult question. I think certainly in terms of the projects of universal grammar and universal semantics.
Or language bound? Is semantics language free or language bound?
I don't know how much semantics is language free, but certainly there are some elements in human cognition which are universal. And those make up a universal human language faculty. But I think that the approaches of universal grammar, for example, that considered that the language faculty was separate from other cognitive faculties is not correct. I think that cognitive faculties in general are human, and the human the human structure, the human physiology, the human nervous system
In that aspect, you differ from
structures those cognitive faculties, and the language participates in those along with other visual faculties or whatever. So I don't think it's separable. But those are difficult questions, and of course it's culturally influenced and culturally limited in some way, but that doesn't make the cultures entirely distinct. In fact, the more we learn about the history of the world, the more we know that cultures have been trading and engaging with each other and exchanging ideas for a long period of time. But those are very interesting questions, and it would take much more to pursue the depth of them.
Yeah. And one point to be raised regarding Rajendran's paper. Rajendran.
Yes, please.
Rajendran was talking about AAP. AAP is historically from Atma, self. So it is Tangal. AAP is similar to Tangal.
Yeah, but that is third person, right?
It's self.
Self.
It
is not first person.
It's not first person, definitely not.
Yes,
but
and linguistically also. If you examine Hindi language, you can see that it is an honorific way of.
True, I understand. My point is that the use of aap in the second person is similar to Tangal. Tangal is also self, referring to the self. Tam, Tangal.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I have not thought about that.
Yeah.
I don't know the etymology of Tangal.
That is so. This is a Davidian convergence.
Do you mean to say that it influenced Hindi was influenced by Dravidian?
Influence of Dravidian on Indo-Aryan.
Okay, fine.
So I have a feeling that in the game between the Indo-Aryan and the Dravidian is the successor.
Very good. Very nice approach. Very nice approach.
Okay.
But, the game.
Okay, that is
a tribute to Professor Panikkar.
So if Professor Panikkar has finished, have you finished? Professor Panikkar? So I have a question to Professor Peter Scarf.
Sure.
Your paper was quite interesting, and you have mentioned something about the word order. So how do you account for the word order in your scheme, in your model? Because I find that this is something which is very sensitive to the Mimamsakas and the Alankarikas, especially in the case of particles and many other parts of speech, how you begin a sentence. For example, drishta sida, something like the sida drishta. Instead of that, poets especially say drishta sida, something to emphasize. So such things are also part of the linguistic experience. And a model which is to map the entire linguistic spectrum will have to come up with some theory about the word order. Unfortunately, Panini does not say anything about the ideal word order in his sutras. But at the same time, we have always been following some sort of a order like Anvaya, for example, where, of course, as you mentioned, the verbal form is the most important element to which all the other things are constituted. That's correct. But at the same time, we'll have to come up with something which will explain the position, the ideal position, so to say, of the words in a sentence. So I would like to know what are your comments on this?
Thank you. It's a very good question and a very interesting question, because sometimes people who speak about free word order go overboard, and that's not my intention, although in the limits of time, I didn't deal with it. The free word order in Sanskrit is free to a certain extent, but not totally free. There are limitations, and there are also conventions that are the predominant word order, or we could say the least marked word order. And there are definite procedures, for example, of highlighting certain elements. So the projects of the phrase structure linguistics that looks at word order and is sensitive to word order is looking for these kinds of things. But since the word order is much freer, it's not the right place to begin. When it shouldn't begin from word order. The word order has certain limits, but they're very restricted limits. So, for example, we know that word order is sensitive in Sanskrit when you can say something like sarvam satyam, but when you use the particle vai, then you would say satyam vai sarvam, and reverse the order. And Panini does actually mention some of these facts of word order in the, for example, in the dhatu sambandhe pratyayaha section in the beginning of the 4th pada of the 3rd adhyaya, and also in the 1st pada of the 8th adhyaya, where he talks about the accentuation of verbs in the presence of particles. So there certainly are limits on the freedom of word order, but the starting point for the expression of the structure is on the cognitive level, and then the restrictions are of a limited sort.
I can understand that. Of course, as you have mentioned, you cannot begin with the word order, but at the same time, you have mentioned subject and predicate are there, and there is a statement, I think, by Kumar Labhatta, anuvadyam anuktya na vidheyam udireyat. Something like that. You cannot speak about the predicate without, positing the subject element. That is there. And, the very first sutra is problematic because instead of Adech Vriddhi, Panini has mentioned Vriddhi Radech, and that has to be explained, even in the composition of sutras, like that. So,
right,
I would suggest that even in an inflectional language like Sanskrit, there is some sort of a word order.
Certainly, and actually, you mentioned the Anvaya, and one project that we've begun to do actually is to mark up in digital form, in using XML, the commentaries on poetry, where the commentators give the Anvaya, and to actually explore what the consistent patterns are in the Anvayas given by the commentators. Now, scholars who are very familiar with Sanskrit implicitly know these things, but it would be a good idea, we think, to actually formalize this knowledge and come to an exact understanding of what the commentators actually do with their Anvayas. And this could be the basis of some further exploration of Sanskrit word order. Instead of us just assuming that we know, let's explore what the Anvaya is in all these commentaries, and see if our implicit understanding actually is supported by them. So, but you're right, the Anvaya seems to be the default prose word order, or at least that's the intention of the commentators. And it's quite clear that the word order in verse, the very fact that word order in verse can change, can depart from that Anvaya, shows that since the verse means the same thing as the commentaries say it means, that the word order is not totally restrictive, but certainly there's a normal word order, or at least marked word order, and that can be explored further.
Hello, Peter.
Dr. Peter, I want to ask you one thing. The traditional scholars, when they discuss Shabda Bodha in Pashya Mrigo Dhavadi, like that. Pashya Mrigo Dhavadi. There is a great bond of content, a great discussion, debate is going on still. How to find out the meaning and how the word order can be placed. And Mimamsakas in one side and Vyagranas in the other side, and Nyayayikas in the other side, they quarrel each other regarding this aspect. What is your opinion in this matter? Pashya Mrigo Dhavadi.
Well, Yes, this is a difficult question. And I remember Professor Cardona bringing this issue up. One of the first sentences we learn in grammar school when we're talking about sentences and their meaning is see, spot, run. See, and Spot is the name of some dog, okay? So see, spot, run. So it's very similar to this Pashya Mrigo Dhavati.
Yeah.
And there are two inflected verbs, and it seems to be a single statement rather than two statements. In other words, Mrigo Dhavati, comma, Pashya. It seems to be something different from that. So that's a difficult question. It's hard to answer that. But in general, I think the Vyakaranas have a more sensitive understanding of the flexibility of language, and I'm not so sure about the Mimamsakas, but I know the Nyayikas have a different agenda. The Nyayikas have an agenda to make it correspond with reality. But the grammarians understand that language is about the cognition of reality, not necessarily about reality. And the cognition of reality is not the same as the reality. So you don't have to have a valid truth statement in order to have a sentence that makes sense, that is, conveys some cognition.
Oh,
I know that's not
thank you.
not a precise answer to Pashya Mrigo Dhavati, but
So, Skafa, I just I'm not finished. I wanted to ask you a very specific question about these suprasegmental features. Do they have any role in understanding the word order, like the accent? It's a question which I wanted to ask.
absolutely. So the accent has a very significant role in understanding word order, and the grammarians more than just occasionally comment on whether there's kaku, some voice inflection that is embedded in a certain statements, and this can change word order. We know that can change word order. So suprasegmental elements, there are suprasegmental elements of different kinds on the phonetic level and on the higher level. I'm not sure exactly which ones you mean besides accent, but accent certainly does influence.
Okay. Yes.
There was someone else who was beginning to ask a question, but I think was not able to articulate her question. Is there another question?
Okay.
From the listeners?
Any other questions?
Can intonation be taken as a morpheme? Intonation of a sentence be taken as a morpheme?
I wouldn't take intonation as intonation as a morpheme. Can intonation be taken as a morpheme? I would say that that tone is morphemically significant. Whether it's an independent morpheme is another question. So, I mean, we all know that the typical example where accent makes a difference in Indra Shatru, right? The Indra Shatru example that Patanjali gives when Tweshter wants to create a son who will be the slayer of Indra. He creates a son who is he whose slayer is Indra by giving it the Bahuvrihi accent with the Bahuvrihao Prakritya Purva Padam, so that Indra Shatru instead of Indra Shatru in a Tatpurusha compound, with the final accent having the high pitch, final sound having the high pitch. So is the accent there a separate morpheme? I don't know that the accent is a separate morpheme, but it's morphemically significant. It's what are these? What are they called? It's contrastive. It has contrastive value.
If that is so, it's a morpheme. Isn't it so?
Question is not audible.
I mean,
He said that makes it a morpheme. It makes it a morpheme to have it be contribute to
any
contrast.
language for that matter. And not only the tone, accent, even the stress, etc., can be considered as a different morpheme. Isn't it so? Independent.
Well, it's contrastively significant. But I don't know that it's a separate morpheme.
Why not?
Why
not?
Just a doubt.
I think up to this time we have not thought of that, but we can consider in that way also possible.
Well, you can define morpheme as anything that's contrastive, then certainly it's a morpheme. Yeah, why not? Why not?
Why not? That's what
I think that should be the answer. I think so.
That means structure is free from its phonetic realization.
Well, now wait a minute. Now, if you're saying phonetic realization, the accent is part of the phonetic realization.
Yeah, that's
isn't it?
true. That's true. That's true. But the whole sentence with intonation is a phonetic reality. The segmental morpheme.
Excuse me, couldn't we put it in this way?
Gives you the sentence.
Yeah, couldn't we put in this way? This accent is a part of the linguistic experience, constituting the initial point of the speaker, and it is also a part of the linguistic experience of the person who hears the sentence. It's very much part of the linguistic spectrum. Maybe it is very difficult to pinpoint it with a formal element, but it is a part of the brain. So I don't know how you people, Chomskyians would, in the deep structure, how do they account for this particular thing? But when we have to analyze the entire spectrum of language, we will have to find out some means, whether it is morpheme or not, to account for this one, because it's very important. It's a marker. It's a marker.
So I see people speak about morphemic accent.
Okay.
Then what is your stand
Morphemic tone.
regarding Kaku? What is your standpoint in that? Kaku.
Well, Kaku certainly is, it has significance.
Yeah.
So it's Kaku is now when the question is whether we consider an accent like Kaku belonging to the sentence as a whole or belonging to a specific morpheme or a specific word or a smaller unit than the sentence. I recall when I was studying German, they were very careful in what we call the structuralist approach to learning German.
Yeah.
At showing the whole pattern of the sentence, the tonal pattern of the sentence. And they were talking about tone that seems to not be limited to an individual word or to an individual morpheme in a word. It seems to have some suprasegmental significance.
Okay.
That's
So
very interesting.
kaku would fall in that category.
Yes.
Probably you can take a lease from the Natya Shastra. It is a part of Vachika Abhinaya.
So I'm just taking a glance at something. I searched the web on this issue about morphemes and tones.
Morpheme, yeah.
And this article seems to indicate that it's called morphemic tone and word tone in Eastern Norwegian. It says the tonal accents of Norwegian are traditionally described as word tones or tonemes associated with words. Now, if they're talking about tonemes, and I think that is, they're calling them tonemes rather than morphemes, but they're certainly, in that case, they're considering them contrastive elements. Whether you want to call them morphemes or not, I think seems to be somewhat debatable, but they're calling them tonemes.
Yes.
Phoneme means it's similar to phoneme. Phoneme means it's similar to phoneme.
Yes.
If phoneme,
A phone,
if a single phoneme has a meaning, you call it morpheme. Single
so the eem in phoneme is telling us that it's a contrastive element.
Yeah,
and we also want to consider tone as a contrastive element. And that much is clear. We all agree on. What we want to call it is something else.
Excuse me.
You want to call it a toneme, that's fine.
Excuse me. Eem, doesn't it mean the smallest unit? Eem?
Well, no. Abstracted unit. Abstracted.
Okay. Because I was thinking about my theme.
Abstracted single unit.
Mythology, we have my theme, then phoneme, morpheme.
It's single and abstracted. And the realizations are allos.
Okay.
Yes, a morpheme is a phoneme. A phoneme is a phonetic unit that is contrastive with other phonetic units, as opposed to an allophone, which is not contrastive. So, for example, a visarga and an S are not morphemes at the end of words in Sanskrit because they're totally dependent on the sequence.
Yeah.
Okay, let us move to some other paper. If any other question, we will, because this debate will not stop here. This debate on font, it will take hours together to
that's true.
have our paucity of time.
We have too many papers now.
Yeah. So if any further questions we can ask, otherwise we can wind up. Now it's 9:30.
Yes, let's do that.
If nobody is turned up for any question, then we can wind up. Dr. Sarita Maheshwaran.
Okay,
Yes,
thank
sir.
you. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So I think the questions from the delegates and participants are over. Now it is time to conclude the session and I move on to vote of thanks. First of all, I extend sincere gratitude to Professor Peter Sharp, who chaired and rendered the keynote address on behalf of all participants of this webinar. Thank you, sir, once again. And I extend my sincere gratitude to Professor C. Rajendran, T.V. Balagopala Panikar, Professor V.R. Muralidharan, and Adiraja. Excuse me, sir. Rajendra, sir. Okay. I extend sincere gratitude to Professor C. Rajendran, Professor T.B. Balagopala Panikar,
Venugopala Panikar.
Venugopala Panikar, Professor V.R. Muralidharan, and Adira Jadavedan for their informative presentation. I thank all delegates and participants of this webinar. Once again, thank you one and all. Thank you all. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. We are concluding the session today, and it was very informative, very interesting. Professor Dr. Peter Sharp has made very active because so many questions has been raised in your paper, and that was very thought-provoking. And so many new ideas have dawned in our mind. Professor Rajendran and Professor Venugopala Panikar all contributed to a high extent. And it was very an intellectual feast. And we are thankful to you. And we are closing the session now. And tomorrow, our morning session starts at 10:30. And we request all participants to be with us by 10:15. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Murali Madhavan, for organizing this wonderful series of seminars.
And thank you for, we were together in Kaladi for several times, and I invited you, you came to Kaladi. I know we were together in several things. Yeah, I remember those days when Professor George Carona was with me in Kaladi. You came there. I remember. I remember. Anyway, now how many, what is your duration in Simla?
I've been in Shimla mostly since last January, and I'm now at the end of my stay, just for a few more weeks.
Okay. Anyway, thank you for your participation and your quick response.
Thank you. Okay, good night, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Scott.
Thank you, Professor Rajendran, Professor Venugopala Panikar, V.R. Muralidharan, Adira Jadavedan, and also the what we call Dr. Sarita Maheshwaran, who convened the session very befittingly. Thank you all.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you.
മുരളി മാഷെ സ്റ്റോപ്പ് ചെയ്യാമോ?
Stop ചെയ്യാം.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Jijo. Jijo, thank you.
മാഷെ
Thank you, Jijo. Tomorrow morning we will join.
കുഴപ്പമൊന്നും ഉണ്ടായില്ലല്ലോ.